Hello and welcome back to another part in my series of videos where we look at changing the operating system that your NAS arrives with. This is a video about installing TrueNAS SCALE on an Asustor NAS, but a few disclaimers straight off the bat. First and foremost, if you've seen my video about installing TrueNAS Core on an Asustor, rhymes, isn't it? TrueNAS Core on an Asustor, this is going to be largely the same as that video. There's just a few installation differences. So again, it's not too much different to that, but I will still cover everything for those of you that didn't see that video. Next thing to bear in mind with this installation is that TrueNAS SCALE, unlike TrueNAS Core, is a Linux developed platform. So although it's still ZFS based and it still provides a tremendous number of differences and improvements over that of the ext4 or BTRFS system ADM that the Asustor includes with this purchase, bear in mind that TrueNAS SCALE and TrueNAS Core are different things, and it is worth taking a little bit of time to research which one of those is better suited to your own hardware, client and network environment. But to business. In today's video, I'm going to be upgrading this, the Asustor 4 from Asustor, from an ADM installation. That's Asustor's own software that's included with it, which is incredibly user-friendly, definitely more user-friendly than TrueNAS, and also has a lot more applications that can be utilized. I'm going to be upgrading, or I say upgrading, changing, depending on your point of view, from ADM onto TrueNAS SCALE, the enterprise open source server platform there. Again, a little bit more complex, hell of a steep learning curve, but it does have ZFS on board and a number of those differences and improvements in RAID resilvering, faster RAID building, triple parity, and more. But before we go any further, let's also talk about what you're going to need for this. This video is going to be in three very distinct sections. This section, where I'm going to show you what you need. The next section, the actual prep and the setup. And the last section, initialization and installation. So, in terms of Asustor NASs that you're going to need for this, you're going to need a certain specific kind of Asustor NAS. You're going to need one that's got a 64-bit x86 processor there on board. So that's Intel Celerons, Intel Pentiums, i3, i5, i7 devices there. There are some AMD processors out there that you can utilize that have got Radeon graphics or Vega graphics on board. At the time of recording, there isn't any of those sort of devices available from Asustor, but they may be there in the future. The reason you need a NAS like that is, one, you need a much more proficient CPU, but more importantly, you need one that's got embedded graphics, so it has an HDMI output. TrueNAS SCALE requires a KVM keyboard video mouse interface in order to be installed. You can't do it over the network remotely. You have to patch in directly to the device with a keyboard and a monitor there. So you need to have an Asustor NAS with that HDMI output there. Now, that kind of runs it down to the Asustor, goes to not the Drive Store series, but certainly the Nimbus Store series there, and a lot of the older generation Asustors as well, in case you're upgrading an old unit. Also bear in mind, everything I'm going to show you today can be reversed, and I will show you during the video exactly what you need to do to reverse your Asustor NAS away from TrueNAS SCALE back to ADM there, which brings us to our next point, storage media. If you're running the Asustor NAS and it has your RAID storage pools, you've got your volumes, you've got your data, you've got your folder structure, you've got your apps there. If you do this upgrade and you keep using those drives inside, they can be reinitialized and wiped inside there, particularly if you're going to be using them within TrueNAS SCALE and its own VDEVs, pools and more. So if you are doing this, make sure your data is backed up elsewhere, but more importantly, remove drives from this system if they have ADM on board and the files that you want to keep, and you want to keep that structure. Take them away, put them to one side, get some new drives, and then put the new drives inside the system. Now, what that means is, later on down the line, if you revert this system back to ADM, if you take those old drives and put them back inside, it will recognize ADM on board and the system will boot up like nothing ever changed. But just bear in mind that you can't use drives with Asustor ADM and its file structure in TrueNAS and vice versa. They are completely different. It would be like taking an SSD with Mac Mac OS, sticking it in a Windows PC and assuming that everything's fine. It won't see the files, and it may potentially completely reinitialize those drives. The next thing to bear in mind, when you are installing TrueNAS Scale on this system, it needs a target drive. Unlike ADM that runs on the drive, so you've got all the storage media and Asustor's ADM all running in that same pool, TrueNAS needs a target drive, much like the drive inside your Windows or Mac machine of an operating system. You need the OS, in this case TrueNAS Scale, to live on a super fast storage area, ideally such as an SSD or targeted flash drive, and then all your actual storage, your day-to-day RAID, onto another area of storage. So a lot of more modern Asustor NASs have M2 NVMe slots inside. Those M2 NVMe slots that are inside these devices support good old M2 NVMe's. These drives you can get as little as 60 to even 120 gigabytes in size and cost you between $20 to $40 for Gen 3 times 2 and times 4 devices, so not a lot. And unlike if you try to use a SATA SSD that will give you between 400 or 500 megs, these can give you thousands of megabytes of performance that you will feel when utilizing TrueNAS. So if you do have an Asustor NAS that has M2 NVMe slots, I strongly recommend getting hold of one of these drives, popping them inside so you can install TrueNAS Scale on that and have a much faster storage experience. You don't have to do that, and it is optional, much like using different drives, but still nonetheless it's very beneficial to you. The next thing you're going to need is a USB drive. You're going to need a USB drive of up to realistically 32 gig. You can use larger, but you will need it formatted to FAT32 logically. You're going to need a USB drive to run the installation. Now by that what I mean is TrueNAS Scale runs as an ISO, a virtual image. It's kind of like a digital replication of a CD or DVD. But do you see a DVD or CD drive on this? And no, you don't. So what you need to do is convert TrueNAS Scale, the digital image, into a USB. And then that USB is what we're connecting to this to install TrueNAS Scale. We're not installing TrueNAS Scale on this and then running it on this system. That is highly unadvised. You need this drive to run the installer package and then install TrueNAS either onto the SSD M2 as mentioned or one of those storage bays. I'm using this, a SanDisk Ultra Fit 32 gig. This USB is not going to go inside. It's going to use one of the available USB ports. And again, this knocked me back about 7 or 8 quid. It's always on offer. I could have gone for a smaller drive. You don't need a bigger drive than about 8 gig in size, really, to do the installation. But at that point, you are talking pence, and you might use this drive for something else. So 7 or 8 quid for a 32 gig stick. It's linked in the description. It's a joke how easy that is. Oh, I should mention there are full walkthrough guide on installing TrueNAS Scale on this is linked in the description over to NAS Compares there. Now, what else do we need? Another option is upgrading the memory on this device. Now this arrives with 4 gig, which is not enough to take advantage of all of the features and services of TrueNAS Scale. You can start running it, but it's recommended to have between 8 and 16 gig of memory to run the full gamut of services that are available in TrueNAS Scale. Again, we aren't just talking about the usual RAID stuff, we're also talking about things like RAID resync, improved performance there. We're also talking about inline data deduplication and inline data inline compression. In other words, on-the-fly services there that require a lot of system resources and memory to do the job. So it's recommended to upgrade those along the way. You don't have to do that to get the best TrueNAS Scale experience. I would recommend doing that. The last thing you're going to need, I've already talked about it, is a keyboard and a visual interface there. You're going to need a USB keyboard. Don't use a wireless keyboard or a Bluetooth keyboard, because what we're going to be doing here is not going to be running on an OS. We're going to be dealing with the BIOS of this system to make the change over to TrueNAS Scale, and there's no guaranteeing that the drivers that you need to run a wireless keyboard are going to be available by default. So use a wired bog standard USB keyboard. You can get them for like 3 quid online. Another thing you're going to need is that monitor. So that's an HDMI monitor or even an HDMI TV. In my case, I'm using a USB to HDMI capture device. That's for today's recording. So if you have one of these knocking around or anything like that, you can go ahead and use that just to see the HDMI output there and run the installation on the keyboard. Remember, you don't need these devices connected to it at all times. Once you've done the initial installation and the setup and initialization, you won't need a keyboard and a mouse again, because you'll be able to access the Asustor running TrueNAS Scale remotely over the network like you would normally. You'll only need them again if you want to run services and run the HDMI input for things like SSH, remote command line, or if you want to revert the system back to ADM, you're going to need a keyboard and a monitor to do that. But that's really it. Those are all of the peripherals and devices you're going to need for this installation today. So the next thing we're going to do is the second stage of this video. We're going to hop over to my laptop. I'm going to show you the software and services you're going to need to download, as well as how to create and prepare our USB installer. Let's make our way over to the laptop. Okay, so we've made our way over to the laptop and we want to get ready to install that TrueNAS Scale. But of course, what we're going to need first is the installer. We've got our USB drive here, and what we want to do is just connect that to our laptop here, and we'll get later on to exactly how we're going to initialize. But for now, let's proceed forward. You may hear fan noise in the background. I've got several NASs on the go here, so you might hear that on the base level of the recording. But the first thing we're going to need to download is TrueNAS Scale, the ISO, the digital image there. So as you can see, this link should be in the description. This is the download-TrueNAS-Scale link. There's also the link to the full NAS Compares walkthrough that has the links to this. And what you need to do is scroll down and either sign up for their newsletter to get updates about it as well as the ISO, or if you don't want to do that, or you've already done so, click at the bottom here and that will take you through the area where you can download the most stable recent release of TrueNAS Scale, their version 22.023 at the time of recording, although there are later versions there of this Linux version of TrueNAS. Go ahead and download TrueNAS Scale there, the stable release, by clicking there, and that will download an ISO version of this file, as we can see here. I've already done it in advance here. Again, what you'll need is TrueNAS Scale, not standard TrueNAS. I've already done a video about that. The next tool we're going to need is this one, Rufus, R-U-F-U-S. This is what we use to convert that digital ISO into our USB drive there. It's very easy, very straightforward, completely free. And if you scroll down, the version that we're going to need is the portable version here. This is one where we don't need to install the application. It just runs directly from that little container, 1.3 megabytes, and it allows us to convert that TrueNAS Scale ISO into a USB bootable there. So make sure to download that. Other than that, the other two tools are optional, but you might find them useful. One is FAT32 Format GUI. This application allows you to turn larger USB drives that are bigger than 32 gig, big old external drives like these, and allow them to be used as installers, because you need to use a FAT32 drive in this setup here. So make sure, if you're going to use a bigger drive than that, to use this tool. Again, completely free to download. And because Windows doesn't format drives larger than 32 gig to FAT32 by default, you can use this tool in order to do that. But otherwise, if you go ahead and use the tiny USB that I told you to, then you won't need this tool. The other tool you're going to need is Advanced IP Scanner, which is a tool that allows you to scan your local area network to find DLNA media devices, NASs, IP cameras, and it is precisely what we're going to need if we want to find our TrueNAS Scale Asustor NAS on the local network environment later on in the video when we're done with the HDMI and keyboard input. So as mentioned, make sure you've connected your USB drive and you've downloaded the tools that I've recommended that are appropriate to you. Then after that, head into where you've downloaded these files, and the first thing we need to run is that Rufus file there. So double click that one. You may see a black screen there. That's just Windows looking for my permission. And if you've connected the drive right, don't worry about formatting it. It should appear there at the top. Just to show you, if I disconnect that drive now, you'll see that drive there at the top has disappeared. So if you connect it there, you'll know that your drive is fine because it will appear there at the top. So next thing you need to do is select this option, select, and then find where you downloaded TrueNAS Scale earlier on and double click. And now you can see it's ready to convert that ISO into a USB for us there. You don't need to change any of the other options, they can all remain as default. You will get a little warning in a moment. And when you're ready, just go ahead and click Start. It will warn you what ISO mode it will use. Just go ahead and use the default mode. You'll be absolutely fine. And secondly, it will warn you that the drive will be completely formatted during this initialization. That's absolutely fine. So for now, go ahead and click OK. Remember, if you do use a bigger drive than the FAT32 drive, it will format the entire drive. It won't just create a small partition. So make sure if you're going to use an external, that the data that's on it is non-essential or at the very least backed up elsewhere. Otherwise, you're going to lose it all. So as it does that, I can guide you through the next area. What we're going to do after this is safely remove that USB and then make our way back over to that Asustor NAS. What we're going to do is get the device set up with our USB drive, with our optional M2 NVMe and our keyboard and HDMI output. And then I'm going to guide you through the initial steps of creating your TrueNAS SCALE installation on an Asustor NAS drive there. But apart from that, these last few percent generally take a little bit longer than you'd like. So I'm just going to spin my wheels in the mud a little bit here and keep talking at you until it's done. But for now, we're finalizing and we are done. So all we need to do now is click Close, go to the bottom. You should have an option here to eject this media safely. So go ahead and eject it safely like so. And now you can remove your USB just like that. And this USB is now ready for our installation. So let's hop over to the Asustor and start getting the device set up for TrueNAS SCALE. Okay, time to get our hands grubby here. Now the first thing you want to do is make sure all the wires are disconnected during this next stage of things. Again, also as mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you have data on your drives that are your ADM Asustor setup with the pools and the apps and you don't want to lose them, take those drives and put them to one side and get some brand new drives for this setup. Otherwise you run the risk of losing that storage and all of that setup that you've spent ages doing on your Asustor NAS. Get your new drives if that's the case and introduce them into your system. The next thing to remember is that you have to have that faster drive for the TrueNAS installation. So either install an SSD inside one of these bays that you want TrueNAS to live on, or if you're running a modern Asustor NAS, remove the top of the chassis and access those M2 NVMe slots there at the top. And then from there, all you have to do is remove the screw there out the top and install that M2 NVMe that you plan on using. You don't need two unless you want to have a backup of your installation and run them in, say, a RAID 1, a mirror, if you will. But at least one drive in that M2 slot will provide the fastest kind of TrueNAS installation for you there. And again, when you do this, you will see the USB drive listed as an available drive to install TrueNAS. Do not install TrueNAS on a USB drive. If you do that, it will run TrueNAS poorly and run the risk of an unstable installation there. So as you can see, we've installed our M2 inside there. Next thing we need to do, if you're going to upgrade the memory, by the way, now's a good time to do it. But if you're not going to upgrade the memory and you don't need to, just slot the lid back on and you're good to go. Put that there. So the next thing you need to do is we'll rotate the device around, is get ready with some of the accessories and peripherals we plan on connecting. So have your keyboard ready. So in my case, it's going to be this USB keyboard here. Again, as mentioned in the intro, you don't need this after the beginning of this video. And again, you connect that in there. If you've got USB 2 ports, I recommend using those just for simplicity. But install those in there and you've got your keyboard all set up. Next thing you're going to need, of course, is the USB drive. This is where we had our installation created there. So we take our installation and we can pop it on the front USB or the rear. It makes no difference. In my testing, I've been using the front mounted USB, but I don't think it makes any difference whatsoever. Next thing we need to connect is the HDMI monitor. In my case, again, I'm going to be utilizing a capture card, but you can use a monitor. It's exactly the same, but it's just for my case, when I'm doing the recording that you're going to see shortly, it's easier for me to connect a capture card. I'll connect that in there, and this end is going into my laptop in just a moment. The last things that we need to connect now, because we've got our storage drive, we've got our USB drive, we've got our keyboard, and we've got our visual out, is of course power and the network. Now, when it comes to the network, you don't have to connect this to the network during the early stages of this setup, but I recommend doing it because during the initialization of TrueNAS, it will set up certain defaults based on what it detects. So I would recommend having this connected, even though the bulk of this initialization at the start is going to be local. Having the network in there will assist a lot of the network defaults when a device sets up. And the last thing we need to connect is, of course, the power. But before I connect this, it's worth reminding you, do not just turn this on immediately and then slowly set up. It's a very important step coming up very soon where timing is going to be quite essential. But for now, let's connect our power. The system will probably light up ever so slightly at the top. Don't let it, if it does that, hold down the power button. You need this to be on a cool, cold boot and have it ready. And the next thing you need to do is be set up at your computer and laptop. And the key you're going to need to focus on is the escape key. Because when this boots up on the HDMI interface, after about 10 seconds, you're going to see the motherboard manufacturer logo. And again, it does differ from device to device. And when you see that, start spamming that escape button, and I'll show you on screen in just a moment to access the BIOS. So that's it, we're all set up. So why don't we make our way over now to the visual interface, and I'll show you exactly what you need to do to power this up. Okay, so we've made our way back onto my laptop here, and again, just before you boot the device, as mentioned, get ready to start tapping that escape button because you don't have a tremendous amount of time to do it. So what I'm going to do now is boot the device up like so. Again, I apologise for any humming and hissing on the bottom level of the noise there in the background. That's largely because of the NAS being right there with its fan and other NASs in the room sort of generating all that fan noise. So I apologise for the sound quality there right in the back end. And I'll try and remove as much as I can. But from this point, as soon as you see that logo there on the middle of the screen, it will differ depending on the device you're using and therefore the motherboard involved. But as soon as you see that, start tapping that escape button until eventually you will be presented with the BIOS menu. Now again, depending on the power of the NAS and the motherboard in question, the amount of time it takes will differ, but you only get about 3 seconds to do it. So it's better to just spam that button. Otherwise, if the escape button doesn't work for you, chances are it's either the F12 or the delete key that you're going to need to use there. But for now, as you can see there on screen, there is our BIOS menu. So the first thing we want to do is go to the boot manager, and this will allow us to select which connected drive on the system we want to use to boot from. Now, it's important to note that in my case, I've got an SSD there on screen, but there's also a few of the others, and the one that we want to select is the USB drive. This is the one that's got that installer for TrueNAS SCALE that we've created earlier on. We will be heading back into the BIOS later on, but for now, let's click enter and boot from this USB. And also, once again, get ready to tap enter again very soon to begin the installation. It will appear on screen and then press enter again. Now, you don't have to rush into pressing enter on that second screen there. In fact, it does count down, and if you don't do anything for 3 seconds, it should boot directly into the TrueNAS SCALE installer. However, if you are running a system that has another drive connected, that has an OS, or has an architecture of being a master boot record, MBR, then what it can lead to is the system still booting in the background. So it makes a lot more sense just to eliminate any doubt and tap enter there to stop the system accidentally booting into an available OS, be it Asustor's own ADM or other. But for now, we're on the TrueNAS SCALE boot up there and the installer, so now we have to tap enter where it says install. As you can see, I'm running a system with less than 8 gig of memory, so it's warning me. Again, it's recommended you go with between 8 and 16 gig, depending on what ZFS services you want to take advantage of. Ignore that black screen stuff in the middle. That is to do with a network controller proficiency there, which we'll talk about later on in the video. But for now, go ahead and say that you're happy to proceed, although I do recommend going for more than 8 gig. So the first thing it's going to do is ask you to choose where you want this to be installed. In my case, I've installed that M2 NVMe at the top, and that's what I'm going to select. So I'll tap the space bar, and it puts a little star there next to that drive, just to denote that that is the drive that I'm going to use. But otherwise, in your case, you will want to choose a different drive. Go ahead and tap the tab bar there to move along the options and select OK once you've selected the drive that you want to install TrueNAS SCALE onto. From there, it will ask you if you want to do a fresh installation or an existing installation. Now, in my case, because I've used this drive in here for a previous TrueNAS installation, it's clearly picked up on it there. You shouldn't have this screen, but nevertheless, just go with a fresh installation, or if you're upgrading from TrueNAS Core onto TrueNAS Scale, perhaps you want to go for the upgrade option. But for now, I'm going to go with a fresh installation. I want to create a completely new boot environment, but I also want to format the entire drive. I don't want to create any kind of partition. And what you can do is choose whether you want to go for half or partial. In my case, you can format the boot drive if you choose, and what that does is completely format the drive for our installation. And again, as mentioned, don't use a USB drive, just use standard storage media that's SATA or NVMe. Now, we need to create our password. So the default admin login is the word root, R-O-O-T, all lowercase, but the password is up to you to decide. So enter the password that you want to use, click the tab key and then verify that password, click the tab key again, and then click OK. And as you can see, it will now start creating the building blocks for our TrueNAS SCALE installation. Next, it's going to ask you if you want to create a swap partition. Unless you know what you're doing or you plan on moving around your installation, I wouldn't bother. Again, if you are worried about redundancy and backups, take advantage of a RAID 1 on 2 drives. But for now, go ahead, and I would recommend, unless you know what you're doing, to go for a no swap configuration there. And there you go. It's now beginning that TrueNAS SCALE initialization, where it's going to unpack the bootloader and install it on our targeted media. In my case, that M2 NVMe SSD. Now, the amount of time this will take is dependent on 1, the NAS you are using and its hardware architecture and power, and 2, the architecture of the drive you are using, be it an NVMe or a SATA drive. So for now, what I'm going to do is fast forward to the completion of TrueNAS SCALE being installed. It shouldn't take too long, and then I'll guide you through a couple more steps on how to set the device up for long-term use, as well as a few tips on how to reverse TrueNAS SCALE's installation back to Asustor ADM if you need it in the future. But for now, let's fast forward. And there you have it. The building blocks towards TrueNAS SCALE on our Asustor NAS have completed there. So what we need to do now is click enter, and the next thing we want to do is scroll down to where it says shut down system. Now this is very important because there's a few things that we need to do now to ensure kind of smooth operation long term of our TrueNAS SCALE system. So shut the system down. Give it a moment. You should see the NAS, the fans power down if you're looking at the rear of it, but ultimately give it just a minute or so. So once it's powered down, as we can see there, the first thing we have to do is remove that USB. It's very important that you remove that USB at this point, because the last thing you want to do is accidentally rerun the installer once again and overwrite all of the hard work we've done thus far. So keep the keyboard and the monitor connected for a little bit longer. And what we're going to do once again is reboot our system, and much like earlier, while the system boots, we're going to wait until we see the motherboard brand logo there, and then we're going to make our way back into BIOS again by tapping that enter button. Now, the reason we're doing this is right now, despite all of the work we've done, again tapping in escape, all of the work we've done thus far, the system will still try to boot automatically into Asustor's ADM initialization and installer, because that's the way the system is built, with that being the default boot drive. We're back onto BIOS. So what we want to do now is disable that feature and allow us to always boot every time we turn this system on into TrueNAS SCALE. So what we need to do is tap down and go into Setup Utility. Now from here, tap right until you get to the option marked boot. Then scroll down to the bottom where it says SD card /eMMC. This is the drive that's inside a small area of flash storage where the ADM installer and its own bootloader live. tap enter, and then from here where you see EFI embedded MMC device, and it will differ depending on the Asustor NAS you're using, tap the spacebar to remove that X from what you saw there on screen. And now when we click escape and when we save it in a moment, from this point onwards, that drive that's got ADM on it is no longer going to be accessed. So by default, the Asustor will now try to boot from that TrueNAS SCALE installation that we've just gone for. Now, later down the line, you may wish to revert back to Asustor's ADM software on this NAS. If you want to do that, make your way back into this setup that you see here in front of us, go back in, and once again, tap space. So from there, the system will go back into ADM. It's that straightforward. And in future, if you want to go back to ADM, whether you're going to go back to the drives that you removed and access your Asustor setup, that's the way to do it. But for now, we're going to proceed with our installation, and we're going to save changes. Make sure you save the changes every time. And we're going to go back to the installation of TrueNAS SCALE and continue with what we were doing before. So again, click save, and this time we do not need to press the escape button. Now at this point, if we want, we can disconnect the HDMI port if we want. We can disconnect the keyboard, all of that stuff, and allow the system to boot into TrueNAS Core as it TrueNAS SCALE as it normally was. However, I still wouldn't recommend it, because there are always going to be small things that could potentially go wrong during an installation that, at least during the outset and on day one, it makes a lot more sense to keep a keyboard and a monitor to hand. Now, the first time you boot your TrueNAS SCALE server, it will take a little longer than normal. We're not going to tap anything. We're going to let the system boot directly into TrueNAS SCALE there. But the first time you boot your TrueNAS SCALE server, it will have to do some initialization choices. Unlike every other time where you boot the device up, because this is the first time it's being unpacked, there will be changes and defaults it will need to set up at the beginning that will be the mainstays moving forward unless you choose to configure them. The installation won't take a tremendous amount of time, but it still is going to take longer to boot the first time you boot than other times later on. But one of the key things to bear in mind, as mentioned earlier on when you're running TrueNAS, is that TrueNAS's recommended minimums and support aren't always universal towards different hardware, and some Asustor NAS systems, their hardware is not going to be compatible by default with the TrueNAS SCALE setup. It should be fine because you are running Linux software on a Linux built system, but still nonetheless, one of the things you may encounter is a network issue where your network adapter of your Asustor NAS is not compatible with TrueNAS. And if that is the case, then on screen it will say that your network adapter isn't working or it's not visible on the network. If that occurs, I recommend using a USB adapter. I mentioned this earlier on, and again, they knock around for less than a tenner, or you can scale up to 2.5G adapters and higher. Just double check they're compatible in advance. But for now, what I'm going to do is fast forward to the completion of TrueNAS SCALE's initialization, and then I'll show you how to access this system via the web browser on your PC. Let's fast forward. So, as you can see, the TrueNAS SCALE initialization has completed there. And as you can see, I've got multiple IPs listed there because I've taken advantage of multiple IP identities to connect this up to my local area network. I've even used a USB adapter. Now, earlier on in the video, you may have seen that little black area there of RTD, which is a Realtek driver. Now, what that is to do with the network ports. A lot of modern Asustor NASs are 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, and therefore they need a driver that connects that architecture to the host system, and some 2.5 GB adapters are still not supported on TrueNAS SCALE or Core because of drivers needed by default within the system software. So again, that's when you need to look at 1 gigabit Ethernet adapters. However, for now, it looks like my web interface can be accessed via a multitude of different network ports that I've adapted there. Now, from this point, if I chose to, I could do the rest of the configuration here on HDMI with my keyboard. But what makes a lot more sense is to access this now via the graphical user interface in the web browser. So what I'm going to do is switch over to my desktop there. I'm going to switch over to the browser. As you can see, the TrueNAS from an earlier installation is no longer accessible, so we'll get rid of that. And then from here, what we're going to do is use that tool that I recommended you to use earlier, known as Advanced IP Scanner. And this will scan your local area network to find your TrueNAS if it is available to you and on the same local area network as your default machine there. It will scan the network environment, and then moving forward you can use that to find the NAS and therefore interact with it. But for now, what I'm going to do is use one of the many network identities that we've got there. I'm going to go ahead with IP 106. So again, I will flick that back on there. We'll make our way back into the web browser and go with 192.106. which brings us to the user interface of our TrueNAS Scale installation there. So from here, we can go ahead and enter root and the password we created earlier, which brings us now into TrueNAS Scale here for installed on that Asustor system. It's running that quad-core Celeron processor, and all of that information we'd like to see, particularly those network identities I mentioned earlier, are now visible on screen. Let's make that a little bigger, shall we? And again, from here, you can set it up. You can start creating your storage pools, start creating those storage pools there very, very easily. On top of that, after you've set up your storage pools, you can start looking into some of the apps and services that you can take advantage of within TrueNAS Scale. All of those different Linux services that were not supported on TrueNAS Core and FreeBSD are available to you. It's that straightforward. Lots of apps, lots of services, and lots of stuff there for us to be playing along with. But this has been how to install TrueNAS Core on TrueNAS Scale on your Asustor NAS. Let me know if you've got any questions. Again, do stay aware of that network adapter support there. Very, very important. I know a number of people have had difficulties there. If you've enjoyed this, click like. If you want to learn more, either click subscribe as we cover this subject more and more. But moreover, use the guide linked in the description over on NAS Compares that breaks down everything you need to know about installing this on an Asustor. And finally, if you need help with your installation, then go ahead and use the free advice section over on NAS Compares, as well as the free community support forum ran by me, Eddie, and a bunch of other users online from the NAS community. Though fair play to Eddie, he's doing the most work on that, and you'll get answers to your questions down there. But apart from that, we will see you next time.